So after more than 2 years after his parents and his siblings died, Henry van Breda was found guilty. And he was sentenced to 3 life terms for the killings of his family members, 15 years for attempted murder on his sister, and 12 months for obstruction of justice. Henry van Breda, Stellenbosch, Cape Town. Hello everyone, so welcome to another story, a real crime that happened in our beautiful Africa. So in today's story we are going to Stellenbosch in the Western Cape in South Africa. So in the Western Cape, in Stellenbosch, there was a family, the Van Breda family, which consisted of 5 members. That is Martin, the dad, Teresa, the mom, Henry. Remember Henry, don't forget Henry, okay? Henry was the son of the Van Breda family, and there was Rudy, the youngest, but there was also Mali. Mali was the only girl of the siblings. Right. So in January of 2015, a call came through 10111. Somebody dialed 10111. Somebody dialed the emergency number. And a call came through, and Henry said, "My family has been attacked by a man wearing gloves and a balaclava, and he was also holding an axe. So he used the axe to attack my family." When police show up at Henry's mansion, yeah, they lived in a mansion. I will give you a backstory about the Van Bredas a little later on in the story. So when the police showed up, they found a boy sitting outside with wounds on his hands, and his clothes were drenched in blood, and the blood of his family members. They go inside the house and they discover 3 dead bodies. Martin, the dad, Teresa, the mom, and Rudy, the little boy. Molly was also badly hurt, but she was still alive. Thank God. Right? Lucky girl. Molly's rushed to the emergency room and she's worked on and everything. And eventually she recovers, but does not remember anything about that night. She is lights out. Doesn't remember anything that happened. Okay? So this was in January of 2015, and Henry spun up a story. He came up with a story about this man that came into their home and attacked his family, and he escaped somehow with just injuries on his hands. And then so he doesn't know where this man is, and he couldn't see the man because the man was wearing a balaclava. There were no fingerprints of this man in this house because he was wearing gloves. Very convenient. Also, the house was a mess when the police came. They were the furniture was all over the place, clothes were all over the place, like it was a crime scene. And it showed like there was a lot of struggling that went on, and a lot of like the attack was bad. Anyway, investigations start, and the neighbors in the estate where they stayed said that there were no intruders, there were no they didn't hear any noises, they didn't hear of anybody who was loitering around the place or anybody who had breached the security. There was nothing suspicious that had happened on that night. Also, in Henry's house, there was no security breach. There was just nothing. There were no fingerprints of anybody else other than those of Henry. All these things that were scattered, the furniture, everything that was scattered had Henry's fingerprints on them. Suspect. Yeah. So Henry was suspect number 1. They waited, hoping Marley would recover and tell them what happened. But unfortunately, when Marley did recover, she was blank. She couldn't remember a thing. So they had to work with what they had. They had to go back to the crime scene and try to reconstruct what happened. And this is what they came up with. Henry did it. And he staged the scene to make it look like somebody came in. But how did this person come in? There was no security breach. There was no forced entry. There was nothing. You would think he could have like broken the door or something, you know, make it look like, but no, Henry did not do any of that. Anyway, in 2016, Henry hands himself over to the police. Yeah, he handed over himself to the police and he still pleaded not guilty. He said he was also a victim of the whole crime, but he was just fortunate enough to have survived. Now, with the marks on his hands, they found out, I think doctors, physicians, I don't know what they call them. They found out that those looked self-inflicted. So he was definitely trying to hide something, and he was inflicting injuries on himself to make it look like probably he was also fighting and trying to protect himself, but those were self-inflicted. That like painted a whole picture, like it was painting the whole picture of what exactly happened, right? So then the trial 2 years later starts. The trial only started, no, not even 2 years later, more than 2 years later, the trial started. And the prosecutor was tasked with proving that Henry did it, while his defense team was tasked with proving that he did not. So this is what the prosecution brought before the court. First, there was no security breach, so definitely there was no intruder in the house. Everybody who was in the house was somebody who was supposed to be in the house. Secondly, there were no fingerprints found of a stranger in that house. The only fingerprints that were found were for the family members. So definitely they couldn't have been somebody else. But Henry had a story to back that up. The intruder was wearing gloves. Right. Neighbors, they didn't hear anybody scream. They didn't hear anybody call out for help. They didn't hear anybody doing any funny activity in the community. Besides that, you couldn't just go into this estate. You had to go through security to get in, and the security officers at the entrance did not report anything dodgy, did not see anything dodgy, did not see anybody trying to force themselves into the community or into the complex or into the estate. I don't know, whichever way you call it, depending on where you are. And also this doctor's report that said the injuries were self-inflicted. That only made Henry look more guilty. The trial ran for 60 days. Yeah, a good 60 days of examining and cross-examinations and, you know, the prosecutor presenting its case, the defense trying to defend their client. And after 60 days, the jury took their time. They took their sweet time to come up with the verdict, because apparently there was a death in one of the judge's family, so they waited. Finally, the jury reached their verdict, and Henry was found guilty. He was found guilty of 3 first-degree murders. His dad, his mom, his little brother Rudy. He was also found guilty of attempted murder on his sister Marley. She did survive, but she doesn't remember a thing. So Henry, because Henry staged the crime scene before he called the police. Remember, he called the police 2 hours after the war attack had happened. He was busy making the crime scene. I'm sure he has watched too many movies that have these crime scenes, and so he was trying to make it look like, yeah, making sure that he crosses all his T's and dotting all his I's. But hey, Henry was not smart enough. He obviously overlooked certain things. But anyway, because he tried to do all those things, he was charged and he was found guilty of obstructing justice. Who knew? I didn't know that if you're going to stage a crime scene, try to mislead the police, trying to mislead the officers of the law, you actually get charged for that. Wow. So yeah, he was found guilty of all the 3 crimes: murder, attempted murder, obstruction of justice. That's in Stellenbosch. So after more than 2 years after his parents and his siblings died, Henry van Breda was found guilty. And he was sentenced to 3 life terms for the killings of his family members, 15 years for attempted murder on his sister, and 12 months for obstruction of justice. Henry van Breda, Stellenbosch. So the news of this crime, like, it took Stellenbosch by surprise, and it also took their family friends from Australia by storm. This is what one of the family members said. Okay, so here's the backstory. The Van Bredas had lived in Australia. They had actually immigrated to Australia and lived there for years. They were citizens of Australia. They ran real estate agents in Australia, in Queensland, and they were described as a very rich family. Martin, the dad, was actually said to be a well-to-do man who was very humble. And their family was described as a very lovely family, a Christian home, a Christian family, by a family friend in Australia. So they then decided that they were going to come back to South Africa and start a private school. The family friend in Australia said when these kids were growing up, they were well-mannered. They would always say, Mr. so-and-so, Mrs. this and that. They were always saying, thank you, excuse me, like they were super polite. And Henry, their murderer, was the quiet one of the 2 boys. Rudy was said to be outgoing and outspoken and always, trying to find adventure. But Henry was said to be very quiet, very reserved, always looking down on his books and concentrating, and very polite as well. So what can we say about these quiet ones? They think deep, right? Still waters run deep, right? So yeah, that's how a family member described this family. And he said these kids were always in their father's office doing their homework after school, and they never got into trouble. Every Sunday they would go to church, and they were doing good in the church. They were very active members of the church in their community, and their family was well respected. What went wrong? What really went wrong? So that's the story of the day in real crimes. So good people, remember to make wise decisions. Stay away from crime, because if you do the crime, you're most likely to do the time. And yeah, stay safe, stay blessed.